Collapse never begins with the violence you see. It begins with the lies you believed before it happened. The gear industry spent decades teaching civilians that survival is a shopping problem, that comfort items will save them, that light, colorful, convenient objects will somehow endure fire, water, shock, cold, and the entropy of human desperation. Reality crushes that fantasy in minutes. When systems fail, the environment becomes a machine designed to erase the unprepared. The human body cannot negotiate with physics. Without heat, microbes win. Without water conversion, organs shut down. Without steel manipulation, biomass stays untouched. Without navigation, terrain becomes a trap. Without controlled light, injury multiplies. Without load transfer, distance collapses. Without shelter adaptation, temperature becomes a kill mechanism. Every historical collapse proves the same pattern. In Sarajevo, families who owned expensive gear still froze because their equipment was not built for repeated failure cycles. In the Eastern Front winters, soldiers with lighter, modern tools died, while those with crude, durable equipment survived months of exposure. In Puerto Rico's blackout, thousands discovered that their emergency kits were engineered for convenience, not continuity. Refugees across every conflict zone display the same truth. Possessions break, logistics evaporate, and only tools that obey the laws of physics endure. The mistake civilians make is assuming survival tools are consumer objects. They are not. They are biomechanical force multipliers. They extend your caloric output, your structural capability, your operational envelope. A tool is not something you carry. It is something that replaces the energy you don't have, the knowledge you can't execute fast enough, or the environmental advantage you lost the moment infrastructure vanished. The 7 tools that matter do not come from marketing departments. They emerge from failure analysis, from battlefield attrition, from long-term isolation scenarios where every gram of gear is either an asset or a liability. They are not chosen by preference. They are chosen by physics. Heat transfer, microbial vectors, steel strain curves, optical signaling efficiency, biomechanical load distribution, atmospheric convection. If a tool cannot manipulate these, it is dead weight, and dead weight kills. You were misled into believing survival is about preparedness. It is not. It is about mechanical capability under collapse conditions. When your body is failing, the landscape is hostile, and time compresses into minutes that decide everything. This series exposes the 7 tools that remain operational when every illusion breaks. Tools that convert chaos into continuity. Tools that keep you alive when the world stops caring whether you do. Fire is not warmth. Fire is control. It sterilizes water, dries fabric, smokes meat, hardens wood, signals allies, deters threats, and resets biological time when cold begins shutting down cognition. Civilians think of fire as comfort. Operational survivors think of fire as a metabolic weapon. In collapse environments, the kill mechanism is rarely the flame you fail to produce. It's the hours of cooling that follow. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself. It degrades decision-making first, then movement, then breath. Once coordination slips, ignition becomes impossible. That is why disposable lighters, matches, and fuel-dependent gadgets are death traps. They rely on dexterity, dry conditions, and intact fine motor control, all of which vanish under shock, blood loss, exhaustion, or freezing rain. Commercial survival kits treat ignition as a one-step action. Real collapse physics treat ignition as a system that must function after gear is soaked. Hands are numb, winds are high, and the brain is slow. Soldiers in the Korean War burned through entire crates of matches with no flame produced. Hunters lost in the Adirondacks carried lighters that sparked but could not sustain combustion in minus temperatures. Civilians in modern flood zones discovered that their waterproof kits were only water-resistant in theory, not after 3 days of saturation and silt intrusion. The pattern holds across every long-duration crisis. The failure of fire is never dramatic. It's quiet. It's a slow thermal drift until the body no longer recovers. That is why a renewable fire control tool must operate independent of fuel systems, moisture, and dexterity degradation. Ferro rods, when engineered correctly, bridge this gap because they obey a simple principle. Pressure plus friction equals ignition, regardless of the state of your hands or the weather. But ferro rods alone are not the tool. The real operational requirement is a high-mass, high-spark density ignition instrument paired with a striker that maintains edge integrity after thousands of uses. This is the difference between marketing and physics. Civilian rods look sleek and modern. Field-grade rods look crude, heavy, and unbreakable because they are designed for repeated catastrophic conditions. In Leningrad's siege winters, survivors who had access to reliable ignition devices could process contaminated firewood, melt snow, and maintain barely enough internal heat to stay functional. Those without spent days oscillating between shivering and delirium before their systems collapsed. Fire becomes a multiplier only when it can be produced with certainty, when the wind strips heat from your fingers, when the storm turns the ground to slurry, when visibility drops and your dexterity fails. Your fire tool must produce sparks that punch through moisture, land on poor tinder, and generate flame despite environmental hostility. Every statistic from cold weather casualty studies confirms the same rule. Ignition failure precedes death by hours, not days. A renewable fire control tool is not an accessory. It is the line between biological shutdown and operational continuity. In collapse, heat is time. Time is life. Lose ignition, and the countdown begins. Water kills long before thirst does, not by absence, but by contamination. Civilians imagine collapsed water as muddy, unpleasant, inconvenient. In reality, it becomes a biochemical weapon. Flood runoff carries hydrocarbons, pesticides, heavy metals, animal waste, human waste, rotting biomass, and industrial residue. When infrastructure collapses, pipes backflow, sewer lines rupture, storage tanks break open, corpses leach into streams, and microbes multiply without opposition. The body does not tolerate this assault. A single cup of contaminated water can destabilize the gastrointestinal system in hours. Vomiting strips electrolytes. Diarrhea accelerates dehydration. Fever amplifies caloric burn. Organ function degrades. This is how thousands died in Haiti, not by violence, by water. The lesson is simple and brutal. Filtration is not convenience. Filtration is survival math. Commercial filters fail because they are designed for hiking, not collapse. They assume low turbidity, predictable sediment, and limited microbial load. They do not account for chemical infiltration, biological concentration, or the pressure variance of damaged membranes. Civilians rely on membrane filters with pore sizes suitable for protozoa, but not for viruses. They buy compact pumps that clog when faced with mud-heavy runoff. They trust inline straws that cannot handle agricultural nitrates or industrial solvents. These tools work in controlled environments. Collapse is not controlled. In the Balkans, displaced families relied on river water that carried the biological load of entire cities. Simple filters clogged within hours. Boiling alone was insufficient because boiling removes organisms, not toxins. Children died not from pathogens but from chemical exposure. In urban blackouts, rooftop tanks collected debris, droppings, mosquito larvae, and airborne pollutants. Those who filtered without pre-settling drank water that looked clear but carried contaminants that no portable recreational filter could eliminate. The operational requirement is non-negotiable. A tool that performs mechanical, chemical, and microbial reduction under worst-case loads. That means a filtration system with a pressure-capable pump, a replaceable or cleanable pre-filter to handle heavy sediment, a microfilter capable of blocking bacteria and protozoa, and a mechanism for chemical neutralization of dissolved contaminants. Survivors in long-duration bush conflicts used precisely this combination. They drew from stagnant swamps, cattle troughs, drainage ditches. They lived because their systems were built to process sludge, not streams. The enemy is not dehydration. The enemy is microbial collapse, your organs shutting down while you still have water in your pack. Once your gut lining becomes compromised, nutrient absorption fails, electrolyte balance destabilizes, and mental clarity fractures. You cannot fight, move, navigate, or reason while your body is expelling everything you consume. Civilian filters treat water as an outdoor inconvenience. A real survival water conversion tool treats it as an adversary. It must endure pressure shock, debris intrusion, repetitive cleaning, and chemical aggression. It must work when the source is a ditch full of runoff, not a pristine alpine stream. When collapse arrives, water becomes the most dangerous substance you touch. You do not drink water. You convert it. Fail that conversion. And survival time compresses to days. Sometimes hours. Steel is the first lie civilians believe. They assume a knife is a knife, that sharpness equals capability, that tactical aesthetics translate into operational function. Steel failure corrects that fantasy instantly. When collapse strips away infrastructure, you are reduced to the physics of cutting, prying, carving, splitting, shaving, scraping, and processing biomass into shelter, tools, and fuel. Every action becomes a negotiation between your caloric reserves and the resistance of the material in front of you. A weak blade increases that resistance until fatigue wins. A broken blade ends the negotiation entirely. In long-duration survival events, the knife is not a weapon. It is a structural manipulator. It converts the environment into resources. When the blade snaps, the conversion ends. In the Pacific Island campaigns, soldiers who carried light, thin blades found them bent or shattered when processing hardwoods for shelter. Edge retention meant nothing when tropical humidity corroded cheap steels into brittle failure. In the Arctic expeditions, stainless steels marketed as rust-proof cracked under extreme cold when used for prying. Civilians in wildfire aftermaths discovered that their multi-tools could not cut rope efficiently, process kindling, or withstand lateral torque when clearing debris. The pattern is always the same. Recreational tools fail at the exact moment serious structural work begins. Operational steel must obey metallurgical reality. Geometry matters more than style. Thickness determines leverage. Spine strength controls lateral load. Heat treatment decides whether the edge folds, chips, or endures repeated abuse. Corrosion resistance is not about shine. It's about survival in moisture-rich, protein-laden environments where blood, sap, and salt degrade lesser alloys. Civilian buyers choose knives by aesthetics, reviews, and comfort. Survivors choose them by failure mode. What happens when the blade meets bone? When frozen wood resists the cut? When prying is unavoidable because shelter framing must be adjusted under storm pressure? What happens when you must baton through wet logs because everything around you is saturated and you need dry heartwood to ignite? In Sierra Crash survivals, those who lived long enough to be rescued consistently performed one task. They processed larger fuel into smaller fuel, not by strength, but by steel. In refugee forest encampments across multiple conflicts, a single field-grade blade allowed a family to split beams, carve stakes, and shape insulation frames. Those who lacked that tool burned twice the calories for half the output, accelerating exhaustion and hypothermia. The truth is not romantic. The knife is not a symbol of wilderness freedom. It is a biomechanical amplifier. It multiplies your force output while minimizing caloric loss. A blade with correct geometry and steel composition becomes an extension of the skeletal system. A cheap or fragile blade becomes a slow executioner, draining energy until collapse follows. The operational steel tool is neither flashy nor lightweight. It is built around mass, edge stability, and a heat treatment engineered for structural abuse. When collapse strips away convenience, you will not remember the marketing language. You will remember the sound of a brittle edge cracking when you needed it most. In survival, steel is not gear. Steel is the difference between shaping the world and being shaped by it. Navigation fails long before you realize you're lost. Not because the terrain changed, but because your cognition did. Collapse strips away clarity. Cold reduces blood flow to the brain. Hunger disrupts glucose regulation. Stress narrows perception until the world becomes a tunnel. Humans were never designed to move efficiently through unknown terrain without tools. Our internal compass degrades under fatigue, fear, and disorientation. That is why lost person studies show a consistent pattern. People walk in circles, veering off by degrees until those degrees become kilometers. GPS dependency accelerated that vulnerability. The moment satellites vanish, whether by blackout, atmospheric interference, or device failure, most civilians lose spatial continuity. They don't understand declination. They can't read microterrain. They confuse slope lines with ridges, drainages with trails, and shadows with pathways. In night movement, these errors magnify until every step becomes a liability. In combat withdrawals and disaster evacuations, survivors rarely die from violence. They die from leaving the safe corridor and entering terrain that degrades mobility, exposes them to elements, or traps them in dead zones where rescue never arrives. The Lost Battalion incident illustrated this perfectly. Units that believed they were advancing along known ridgelines instead moved into concave terrain that funneled them into enemy fire. In wilderness, SAR operations, people who began with confidence drifted off course by only a few degrees, enough to miss water sources, shelters, or rescue routes. Even experienced hikers failed when visibility dropped and cognitive load increased. Darkness, fog, smoke, and storm patterns distort depth perception, turning familiar shapes into threats and safe routes into illusions. Civilian navigation tools fail because they are electronic crutches, not mechanical certainties. Power banks drain under cold, screens crack under impact, signals vanish without warning. A real navigation tool must not require satellites, electricity, or processing power. It must function under rain, wind, snow, low visibility, and trembling hands. The compass is not a nostalgic relic. It is an unbreakable truth machine. It restores linear movement when the brain cannot. It imposes direction when fear dissolves logic. It prevents the fatal drift that kills lost civilians and exhausted soldiers alike. But a compass alone is insufficient without the second half of the equation: terrain dominance. Understanding contour lines, valleys, ridges, and watercourses turns a map into predictive intelligence. Micro-terrain reading saved entire units in Afghanistan when GPS systems were jammed. It allowed them to bypass ambush zones, avoid natural traps, and conserve energy by choosing ridgelines instead of drainages. In refugee movements across the Caucasus, families who understood terrain flowed with geography instead of fighting it. Those who didn't climbed into exposure zones where wind ate their body heat and nightfall erased visibility. Navigation is not about finding the fastest route. It is about avoiding fatal ground. The operational navigation tool, an analog compass paired with a physical map, provides this advantage. It is immune to EMP events, immune to blackout, immune to battery collapse. It gives you a bearing when your brain is deteriorating from cold, shock, or dehydration. It anchors your movement to reality when time pressure forces decisions you cannot afford to improvise. Collapse punishes the directionless. It turns hesitation into exposure, confusion into immobility, and immobility into death. When systems fail, the environment becomes a maze with no signage. Only one tool restores order, not through information, but through certainty. A compass does not care if you are tired, scared, or disoriented. It points. You follow. You live. Darkness is not the absence of light. It is the collapse of control. When visibility drops, every hazard becomes silent. Uneven ground, sharp debris, predators, unstable structures, hostile movement. In operational environments, most injuries occur not from the threat itself, but from what the survivor never saw. Civilians underestimate darkness because they experience it in cities, with ambient glow bleeding through windows and streetlights. True collapse darkness behaves differently. It is total. It blinds depth perception, erases pathways, distorts distance, and fractures coordination. The human brain burns more energy in the dark because it cannot predict spatial input. That metabolic drain accelerates panic, decision fatigue, and mistakes. Commercial flashlights fail the moment conditions shift. Battery-dependent devices become liabilities in cold weather as chemical reactions slow and output drops. LEDs dim after impact shock. Switches corrode when submerged. Solar chargers promise hope but collapse under cloud cover or repetitive debris abrasion. A light that depends on logistics is not a survival tool. It is a countdown timer. During the Chilean mine disaster, trapped workers rationed their remaining batteries with mathematical precision, not because they needed light for comfort, but because darkness created psychological fragmentation. Individuals separated from the group began hallucinating, misjudging distances, and injuring themselves in confined spaces. Light preserved the unit as much as food did. In earthquake wreckage, rescuers repeatedly found that survivors with functional, mechanical light sources outlasted those with dead electronics. The difference was not brightness, it was certainty. Mechanical light, generated by physical action rather than stored power, endures impact, moisture, pressure, and neglect. It works after being crushed under debris, after being soaked for days, after being frozen in sub-zero temperatures. It requires no battery, no sunlight, no electronics. It is immune to EMP, grid failure, and moisture intrusion. But the true value of light is not illumination. It is signal control. In trench warfare, soldiers learned quickly that uncontrolled light invited enemy fire. In modern blackouts, civilians who used bright lanterns unintentionally broadcast their position to threats, human and otherwise. Operational light must be directional, shielded, and adjustable. It must provide enough visibility to navigate hazards, but not enough spill to reveal your presence across a field or alley. Light discipline is a survival mechanic. Movement in short bursts, beam minimized, angles controlled, reflective surfaces avoided. The tool must allow this level of finesse. Civilian lanterns cannot. Mechanical signal tools can. During prolonged power outages in Eastern Europe, families with hand crank light survived nights without injury, while neighbors using candles triggered structural fires or carbon monoxide poisoning from improvised heating. The lesson repeats across crises. Candles burn oxygen, batteries die, electronics fail, mechanical light persists. In open terrain, light also becomes a deterrent. Predatory animals hesitate when confronted with controlled beams that move with purpose. In urban collapse, controlled flashes communicate presence to allies without revealing position to watchers. The right tool can send pulse signals detectable at distance while remaining nearly invisible from side angles. When collapse deepens, darkness becomes the most consistent enemy. It slows movement, increases injury, disrupts morale, and fractures group cohesion. Reliable light restores operational tempo. It preserves mobility. It prevents falls, cuts, punctures, and immobilizing injuries that end survival attempts before hunger or thirst do. In environments where every calorie counts, avoiding injury is strategy, not luck. The mechanical light tool does not promise brightness. It promises continuity. It will not blind you with intensity or seduce you with sleek design. It will simply work after the battery dies, after the charger breaks, after the grid stays dark for weeks. In collapse, light is not comfort. It is the difference between choosing your path and stumbling into your fate. Mobility decides survival, not strength, not gear, not intention. Mobility. The ability to move weight over distance through unstable environments without destroying your joints, your spine, or your remaining caloric reserves. Civilians misunderstand this completely because modern life eliminates load stress. Cars carry weight. Elevators carry weight. Pavement reduces strain. When collapse removes those supports, the body becomes the only vehicle, and most bodies are mechanically unprepared. Every historical displacement event proves the same pattern. Those who cannot transport essential weight fail within days, not because they lack food or water, but because they cannot move food or water. Refugees in the Greek Civil War carried bundles so poorly balanced that their shoulders tore open. Evacuees during the California wildfires collapsed from load-induced heat exhaustion after only a few miles. In the 1940 Finnish retreat, soldiers lost not from combat, but from carrying loads that exceeded biomechanical thresholds, turning each kilometer into ligament damage and circulatory strain. Civilians choose backpacks for aesthetics, padding, and pockets. Survivors choose them for geometry, frame structure, and load transfer. There is a physics to carrying weight. The hips must bear the mass, not the shoulders. The spine must remain vertical, not bowed. The load must sit close to the body's center of gravity, not sag outward where torque multiplies exponentially. Every deviation increases energy consumption, accelerates muscle fatigue, and compounds micro-injuries until movement becomes impossible. In long-range patrols across Afghanistan, units survived days of forced marches because their load-bearing systems transferred weight into the pelvic structure. In contrast, irregular forces using improvised bags exhausted themselves before the fight began. The difference was not endurance, it was engineering. Poor load distribution cuts mobility in half. Good distribution doubles it. Civilians imagine collapse as a scenario where they bunker down. Real collapse forces movement, away from fires, away from contaminated zones, away from hostile groups, toward water, toward shelter, toward extraction. Every movement demands weight. Water is heavy. Tools are heavy. Insulation is heavy. A naive pack collapses under strain, tears at seams, or grinds into the shoulders until nerve compression sets in. Once the arms go numb, coordination fails. Once the lower back spasms, movement stops entirely. During the Syrian displacement, families who used agricultural sacks, school bags, or fashion packs reached exhaustion within hours. Those with field-grade external frame systems crossed borders. The frames mattered because they converted chaotic weight into structured load paths, allowing skeletal alignment instead of muscular desperation. The operational load tool is not soft, slick, or convenient. It is rigid, where civilians expect flexibility, and structured, where civilians expect padding. Its straps do not prioritize comfort. They prioritize mechanical leverage. Its frame absorbs shock loads. Its hip belt locks the mass into the body's strongest point. Its shoulder straps stabilize without suffocating circulation. The pack becomes an exoskeleton, not a container. Mobility is also injury prevention. A twisted ankle under load becomes catastrophic. A strained knee ends transit permanently. Once immobile, everything collapses. Distance to water increases. Exposure risk climbs. Caloric demand rises while caloric intake falls. Immobility is a death multiplier. A proper load transfer system reduces the oscillation of weight with each step, stabilizing gait and preventing impact injuries. It keeps the body aligned, reducing the decay that accumulates over hours of movement. In protracted evacuations, survivors who managed their load correctly traveled up to 4 times farther with half the exhaustion, not because they were stronger, but because their tools preserved biomechanics. Collapse punishes inefficiency. Every wasted calorie reduces survival duration. Every misaligned load accelerates joint degradation. Every unnecessary pound becomes a hazard. A load-bearing tool is not about carrying more. It is about carrying what matters without destroying the only machine that keeps you alive, your body. In collapse, mobility is the last freedom you possess. Lose it, and the environment cages you. Preserve it, and every option stays alive. Shelter failure does not kill by drama. It kills by arithmetic. A slow bleed of body heat. A creeping saturation of moisture, a compression of air volume that suffocates insulation. Civilians imagine shelter as a tent, a roof, a surface to sleep under. Operational survivors understand it as a thermal equation. Exposure is the most efficient kill mechanism in nature, and it requires no aggressor, just conduction, convection, evaporation, and time. When collapse removes heated buildings, insulated vehicles, and climate control, the human body becomes a vessel constantly losing heat to the environment. Without the ability to manipulate shelter materials mechanically, that loss becomes irreversible. Commercial tents promise comfort. They deliver failure. Thin fabrics collapse under wind load. Poles snap in repeated gust patterns. Condensation saturates sleeping systems until evaporative cooling drains the body throughout the night. Worst of all, tents trap cold air when the temperature plummets and trap hot air when humidity rises. They are designed for recreation, not survival. In the Himalayan storms of 1996, climbers in high-tech tents froze because their shelters could not counter sustained wind-driven convection. In Siberian field encampments, workers died inside tents that had intact fabric but lacked proper airflow and reflective insulation. The shelter existed. The survival mechanism did not. Operational shelter is not about hiding from weather. It is about controlling the transfer of heat. A tarp becomes a roof only when tension is correct, angles optimized, and airflow intentional. Reflective surfaces become heaters when positioned to rebound radiant energy. Natural materials become insulation when layered with correct density. Every climate requires a different approach. In wet environments, elevation prevents moisture ingress. In cold environments, low profiles reduce convection. In mixed climates, modular designs allow quick adaptation as conditions shift. The tool that makes this possible is not a tent. It is a shelter converter, a device that manipulates fabric, cordage, branches, debris, and reflective materials into stable structures. Soldiers in long-term reconnaissance operations survived weeks because they carried a simple, durable, adaptable tool that allowed them to shape shelters to terrain, not terrain to shelters. They combined tension lines, anchor points, and improvised frames into microclimates that retained heat, deflected wind, and shed water efficiently. Civilians with fixed tents froze while those with adaptive systems endured. In post-collapse Siberian villages, families who understood thermal layering converted scrap plastic, canvas, and wood into shelters that outperformed manufactured tents. They built double-roof designs that trapped warm air, reflective barriers that rebounded body heat, and vent systems that prevented moisture accumulation. What allowed this was not the materials. It was the ability to manipulate them correctly. The shelter tool turned random debris into engineered structure. Heat loss happens in 3 dimensions. Conduction through the ground steals warmth faster than cold air. Convection strips heat whenever wind penetrates gaps. Radiation drains energy into the open air. A true shelter tool enables you to combat all 3. It drives stakes, tightens cordage, shapes angles, cuts limbs, carves notches, and maintains structure under load. It lets you build a raised bed to avoid ground conduction, a sloped roof to shed rain, a wind wall to block convection, and a reflective panel to return radiant heat. Shelter is not a product, it is a physics problem. And when the temperature drops, physics does not negotiate. It demands structure, it demands tension, it demands insulation. Civilians die because they rely on objects. Survivors live because they rely on tools that transform environment into protection. Collapse does not forgive shelter mistakes. One poorly tensioned line becomes a leak. One gap becomes a wind tunnel. One sagging roof becomes a failure point that drenches insulation and accelerates hypothermia. Shelter is stability, warmth, and continuity wrapped into a single system. Without the tool that enables adaptation, you are exposed, literally and mathematically. When the world strips away safety, shelter becomes your final perimeter. And only those who can build, reinforce, and adapt that perimeter survive the night. Survival is not mystery. It is mathematics. A collapsing environment reduces life to inputs and outputs, heat produced versus heat lost, water consumed versus water contaminated, calories spent versus calories converted. Every tool you carry must compress those ratios in your favor. Anything else is dead weight disguised as preparation. Civilians drown in gear because they misunderstand the enemy. They think the threat is the storm, the wilderness, the chaos. The real threat is energy deficit. Every mistake accelerates it. Every inefficiency compounds it. Collapse punishes the inefficient with mechanical certainty. The 7 tools exist because they correct the 7 most lethal failure points in human survival. Fire restores thermal balance when the environment steals heat faster than your body can produce it. Water conversion prevents microbial collapse that shuts down organ systems long before dehydration sets in. Steel manipulation converts terrain into structure, fuel, and leverage, turning raw material into capability. Navigation prevents directional decay, the drift that transforms simple movement into fatal disorientation. Mechanical light preserves mobility and injury prevention when darkness erases your spatial awareness. Load transfer protects the biomechanical system that moves you through the world, preventing a cascade of injuries that immobilize you. Shelter conversion manipulates physics itself, bending wind, water, and temperature into forms that extend life. When studied together, a pattern emerges. These tools do not make you stronger. They make the environment weaker. They reduce the cost of survival. They convert random chaos into predictable mechanics. They impose order where your body alone cannot. Marketing hides this truth behind aesthetics. Real collapse exposes it with cruelty. Everything unproven breaks. Everything unnecessary becomes burden. Only the tools rooted in physics, biology, and historical failure endure. In every war zone, famine corridor, floodplain, and blackout region, the survivors who lasted were not the ones with the biggest kits. They were the ones with the smallest number of tools that solved the largest number of problems. Tools that replaced calories. Tools that replaced knowledge. Tools that replaced time. Tools that never stopped working even when their owners were freezing, drenched, exhausted, or bleeding. Tools that turned failing human bodies into functional systems for one more hour, then one more day. Collapse does not care about optimism, gear reviews, or good intentions. It cares about physics. It cares about microbial spread, thermal loss, joint failure, load vectors, and water contamination. It cares about the mechanical truth that the human body is fragile, and the world becomes hostile the moment infrastructure dies. If your equipment cannot shift those equations, it is irrelevant. You were misled because the world was stable enough for the lie to survive. Stability made people forget that survival is not about owning objects, but about altering outcomes. These 7 tools do exactly that. They are not accessories. They are extensions of your metabolic system, force multipliers that turn collapse from a death sentence into a solvable problem. When everything collapses, you won't rise to the occasion, you will fall to the level of your tools. If they're the right ones, you live. If they're not, you don't.